Hello and welcome to the Picket Studios YouTube channel. It's Rachelle Olteen here with you today, and I've got a great new video featuring a fun interactive rocker card using the Halloween graveyard cover plate die and the Not Scared, You Should Be stamp set. This card design starts with two circle dies. The base is a 5-inch diameter and the top panel is a 4.5-inch circle. The 5-inch base was die cut twice from heavyweight black cardstock, and each one was scored in the middle. The fold was reinforced with my bone folder. I secured one of these circles down to my glass mat along the fold line with some low-tack tape. I really love the new Paper Glitz, and I chose to use the lime Christmas green for the rocker base. I always give it a quick stir with the palette knife to be sure that all of the sparkly glitter at the bottom has been redistributed throughout the entire medium. I usually apply the Paper Glitz with the bottom of my palette knife and use just a small amount to start. When the knife starts to drag just a bit across the surface, I know I need a little bit more glitz. Paper Glitz is self-leveling, but I do try and smooth it in long strokes to finish it up. I just love the depth of color in the surface, especially on a dark cardstock. There are variations of pigment and multiple glitter colors, so it ends up being super dimensional. I carefully peel off the tape and set this aside to dry. I don't know about you, but I tend to over-engineer things sometimes. But the top panel of this card really needed to be pretty strong, so I die cut two 4.5-inch circles from the burnt orange cardstock. These two panels were glued together and set under a large stamp block to dry for a minute. I then added one more black cardstock circle to the back to prevent warping because it was going to be covered with Paper Glitz. I used the Autumn Persimmon Glitz, and after giving it a good stir, I spread a light coating across the orange circle. Now, I really wasn't trying to be exact with this coverage. I really liked the slightly uneven look I got from this textured cardstock, and so I set it aside to dry. I just love this new graveyard cover plate die, and I know it's going to become one of my favorites. This scene's got tons of great detail, from the spooky trees to the top of those tiny tombstones. But because of all the small shapes, I die cut this with my metal adapter plate and then very carefully pulled the die cut out with my craft knife. Now, if you don't have an adapter plate, don't worry. You can always use a few paper shims to add a bit of pressure to the detailed areas. It's so much fun watching all the little bits and pieces being poked out in fast motion, even though it only took me a couple of minutes to do this in real time. I added just a bit more detail by backing the haunted house with a piece of lime green cardstock, which would shine some bright color through the windows. I used a scrap piece of the house die and trimmed off the edges to create a template, which I then traced onto the green cardstock. I hand cut the shape and had to adjust it just a couple more times by trimming off tiny slivers of the cardstock so that the sizing was correct. I know this is probably not the fastest way to create this panel, but it really does work every time. I added liquid glue to the back of the house and then added the green paper behind. I dusted the front of the die-cut graveyard with my anti-static powder bag and then put it into the MISTI. I determined the placement of the sassy sentiment, "Now that's some boo sheet," and stamped it with Versamark ink. I coated the sentiment with white detailed embossing powder, tapped it to remove the excess, and then went back in and carefully brushed off any stray remaining powder with a fine watercolor brush. I heat set the sentiment panel, and after letting it cool for just a few moments, I lightly wiped off any excess anti-static powder. I always go back in and add a little bit of black marker to cover any stray bits of the remaining embossing powder. Since the graveyard die cut was going to cover the rocker fold, I felt like it needed a bit of reinforcement, so I die cut another base piece, trimmed off the top details, and then glued it onto the back. At this point, the lime glitz on the rocker circle was dry to the touch, and I could now reinforce it with the second black cardstock circle die cut. It was key that the second circle was just a bit smaller than the first so that the card would rock evenly. So I simply trimmed off a bit of the edge following the stitch detail, added lots of liquid adhesive, and glued it to the bottom, aligning the creases. I then used my bone folder to really compress the edge and set it aside to dry. I prepped a piece of heavyweight vellum with my anti-static powder tool and placed it into my MISTI. I love this vellum because even though it's a 40-pound weight, it's still very translucent. I stamped the standing ghost from the Not Scared, You Should Be stamp set with Versamark ink and coated it completely with the same fine white detailed embossing powder. This heavyweight vellum embosses perfectly, and I always start with a gentle heat on the back side and then move the heat to the front until it's done. Once the embossing had cooled a bit, I used my small scissors to fussy cut the vellum ghost. I really love how shiny white he is on that vellum. To attach the orange panel to the green rocker, I lined everything up on my glass mat and drew marks onto the back side. I covered this area on the back side of the orange circle with tons of score tape all the way to the edge and then reattached it by lining up the tick marks. The inside rocker fold was reinforced with my bone folder. I determined the placement for the ghost image, marked its location, and then adhered it onto the orange panel with score tape. This card was weighted just a little bit to the right side due to the extra weight of the ghost, so I offset this by adding a couple of layers of chipboard to the left side of the graveyard. In my original card, I ended up adding a penny underneath just to make it rock correctly. Score tape and foam tape were added to the back of the graveyard panel to account for multiple levels of cardstock and pressed into place. I die cut 2 small bats that are included with the Witch Slimline die cutting system insert and glued them onto the orange sky. To finish up the card, I added a mix of orange and iridescent sequins from the Trick or Treaters Sequins Mix Plus. Here's a look at the finished card. I really love that Paper Glitz combo of the lime Christmas green and the autumn persimmon. It's a classic Halloween palette, and the ghost in the graveyard really pops against those colors. By backing the top panel with the black cardstock, the reverse side of the card looks very finished, and you can simply write your greeting with a gel pen in contrasting color. Here's the finished rocker in action. Thanks so much for joining me, and check out all of the great new Halloween products over in the Picket Studio shop. Happy crafting, and have a wonderful day.